As a corollary to that last one, I can suggest that I have a strong and abiding sense that some of the most important events in my life never happened to me. In what we are pleased to call the real world, at least, which is, after all, real. And that countless, totally unimportant events happen in my life all the time. It came to me when I was writing Communion, and it, in a way, helps to understand that book. I was watching a football game on television. I am cursed to be a fan of the Toronto Argonauts, because in the mid-1940s, I knew some of the players. One of them was my counselor at a summer camp I went to, and I used to go down to Varsity Stadium and watch Joe Kroll and Royal Copeland and all these people win games. And so I am, talking about someone being doomed to go on in life, I am doomed to go on in life as a Toronto Argonaut fan. And I was watching a game in which someone, quite predictably with the Argonauts, burst into the Toronto Argonaut backfield and knocked down a pitch-out pass. And drinking away at my beer, I remembered when I did that, when I played football at TCS, Trinity College School in Port Hope, Ontario. And then about 5 minutes later it came to me, I never did that. I mean, I was really an appalling football player because I was afraid I was going to get hurt. The coach always used to say the first thing you've got to do in the first play of the game, you've got to leap across the line and hurt the fellow who's opposite you. And so we all would concentrate on that and grit our teeth and get all prepared. In the first play of the game, the guy opposite me would leap across and hurt me. At any rate, it came to me that I had, because I'd been a lousy football player, and for reasons which are obvious, it's worse being a lousy football player having tried being a football player than not to have been a football player at all. I had somehow, totally inadvertently, created at least this one play, which was a triumph on my part. I don't know when I did it. I began to think I did all kinds of other things like that. And that some of the most important events in my past are my response to events, not events. Anyway. I could also say I write because working on a novel is the only way of pursuing a process of discovery that compels me. That the only way I can get to some sense of understanding of what preoccupies me is by getting it into a book. I can go on and on like this, but none of it seems to do any real justice to the question, to the activity of writing. For example, there are long periods when I don't write at all, when I can't write. I want to write, but I don't write, or else I write so badly that it's embarrassing. So perhaps a facile answer to the question, and I have to read this one because it's kind of hard to read. Perhaps I write when I can, because I can write when I can. As for the question of who I write for, I think it's quite clear that I write for the book until the book is finished. That is the only real concern. When the time comes for revising, I not only revise the book, but I revise it for an ideal reader. Now, the ideal reader for me, and I'll stop it with this, since somehow I accept, and I think it's very close to Bob's idea of field notes, I accept that novels are maps of an emotional, intellectual, and spiritual journey. Then for me, the ideal reader is one who wants to and does partake of that journey, and in the process augments it and enriches it. Thank you.
Or as long as these gentlemen wish to do it, to comment on each other's comments or each other's statements. Do you want to?
Well, I'd just like to ask Graeme if he could expand just a little bit on the nature of consciousness.
I'm glad you said a little bit. It seems to me that it has a lot to do with the fact that there isn't much new to say ever, and there's not much new to discover in your reading. except the consciousness that perceives what on the whole we know. And that for me at any rate, and I have blurring very badly consciousness, because it leads over for me at any rate into voice and vantage in relationship to the material, the vantage point of the writer in relationship to his or her material. The thing that compels me most in reading the books that compel me is the nature of the consciousness and the nature of the voice and the relationship to the material that the writer is conveying within the substance of the book, in a way that's for me obviously style and content are inseparable, because it all has to do with what I rather superficially called consciousness.
I wonder if that's anything. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is the need for what Bob said, validating their voices, and that's a kind of an awareness of a consciousness that is.
Okay. When Bob had said that, I recognized that there was a kind of lack in what knew I was going to say, and so I will immediately incorporate it underneath the nature of consciousness. Oh.
Well, I just worked for a week with students here, and I'm impressed, or was very much impressed by their sense of place, Fred. Mm-hmm. The tremendous sense of how you find story in Kootenay valleys. And I wonder how you feel about the idea of place as poet, especially in the light of the title of your selected poems.
Place as a geography has always been important to me, because it became important to me when I wasn't here. I found that I was writing an awful lot about mountains and creeks and glaciers when I was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Buffalo, New York, and that kind of amazed me, that I could be so I could get so much into that when I wasn't here, and yet when I came back. For the first few years after returning to the Kootenays, I didn't write. I was just knocked off my feet. I was breathless. I couldn't. Here was all the stuff I'd been writing about, literally the images that I'd been carrying around in my head for a few years, and there they were. I was looking at them. I was looking at Kootenay Glacier. I was looking at a mountain, and you can't write about it. It's there. Just leave it, let it be. So I just about gave up writing because of the place. But then also I feel, I guess a lot like you do, that I wanted to validate the place as the particular place, as a particular experience of the place. I didn't want the mountain to simply be a mountain, or even run the danger of entering that symbology of literariness of a mountain. I wanted it to be a particular, not even a particular mountain, but a particular set of words that had mountainness in them. So place became the geography became a kind of spiritual geography. The place became, once again, inward, or a shared inward-outward thing. But place is certainly, I think, important in BC. In Canadian writing, place has become very important over the last 20 years, at least in the West. I think for the reason you say, people want to validate where they are, or what they're perceiving as where they are.
I'd like to ask Bob particularly, because I'm not sure how it applies to, if it applies as explicitly to poetry as I think it does to the novel. Whether you think that it's possible to write successful novels, presumably one could write one, successful novels that aren't rooted in place, in a particular time and place. It seems to me the demands of the form of the novel insist upon that kind of vernacular.
Yeah, they'd be very exceptional, the novels that don't insist on that dimension of realism. We do like a sense of locus or place, and I suppose it's the stuff of imagination, really, isn't it? The idea of place itself. I don't know, Fred, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I think it's the imagination. It's the imagination because simply because it becomes image, because you're certainly not looking at it all the time, other than as an image that you carry around with you. And the place is simply the place outside of that. It goes on doing what it does, and the image becomes activated by, I hope, becomes activated by my own intelligence. That I have something to do with it. At the same time, I realize, too, that the place sometimes becomes not the place that the reader wants to hear about, or that that's not the place that I should be buttressing up for a reader's awareness. It gets, for example, for me, extremely difficult to write about Canada because it doesn't exist as a place. You can't see it. You can't. There's nothing tangible there in terms of the geography, which I can, honestly admit to myself. So right away, I feel suspect about, the apple of John A. Macdonald's eye, just because he thought, because it was an idea. There's no reason why I have to.
Well, I think it's important to remember that Shakespeare did not write for English departments in Canada and the United States. He was writing for a very particular audience on the banks of the Thames, a very small audience, by the way, a couple of 100,000 people probably. He was aiming exactly at that audience. He was talking to them, and he was talking about them. And he didn't even try to publish the plays, as a matter of fact. He just wanted those performances for those people. And what happened on this international and beautiful scale, of course, was an accident that he didn't intend or care about. He was talking to those people about their lives.
Yeah, I have this sense of like who I'm writing for literally being about 400 people. I mean, I know that because of how many books I sent.
Assuming 10 people read each book, that would be...
This feeling that I've met all my readers, like I know them all. I could, and this game of like putting them out in a through a publishing house is just that. It's an economic vain game at times.
I remember I was with Scott Simons once, and someone, as people sometimes do, apologized that they'd never read any of his books. He said, "That's all right. You don't have to now. You've met me."
I was wondering, while we're on that issue of publication, Bob, what your experience in China, the whole idea of being public is that it's what is their sense
of course, a literary magazine there has a circulation of from 100,000 to 1 million, so it's a little bigger market than ours. And still, of course, that's only it's a small percentage of the population, but they have an incredible circulation, and they have very many literary journals, just an incredible number of them. I suppose there's less competition for a literary journal there, insofar as television hasn't yet taken over the audience so much, and that sort of thing. It's a population that reads a great deal.
Did you feel if you could be comfortable in such a society as a writer?
Well, the people I met, of course, were approved people. So I imagine there are Chinese writers who are more restless than the ones I was reading. It's an incredibly attractive society to live in, I'll tell you that. I think that there were 7 of us, and we felt uneasy about the role of the writer. I have to say we felt pretty uneasy about the role of the writer. At least those we met were certainly giving us a party line in many ways.
Were there a real range of age of them, or they tend to be limited?
Well, it was interesting. The older writers seemed much more flexible, and they'd gone through a number of experiences. We talked to 2 young writers who were really hardliners, and they really. And the funny part was one of the men who was a young man of about 35. was an insane ego. He told us his whole publishing history. He published a book when he was 15 and 11 books by the time he was 23 and a half, and then insisted, of course, he didn't believe in ego or self at all. But, you know, I saw a very small part of the population of writers there.
Other comments? Yes. Do you want to open it up?
Open it, sure.
Okay. People have questions now for the panel, based on what they said or otherwise. Yeah.
You talk about language, and to me, you talk about very abstract language. As a feminist and sometimes writer, I know that there's been, I saw it more than here, and a lot of the discussion has been, all of the discussion from a male writer's point of view. I want to know, from a personal male writer's point of view, what the effect on your writing has been of feminist and women's demand for change in the languages we use it for, recognition that language has social meaning, that to say mankind has an effect on womankind to the extent that it leaves her out. How do you react to that? Does that have anything to do with your creations, since they seem to be such on such a personal plane?
I'd like to respond to that just briefly. For myself, some of the writing which has come from the recent feminist movement in literature has had a profound influence on me, and it's because I see the certain female writers, not all of them, but certain female writers, as being at a frontier or at the edge of having to discover a language, of having to find a language for themselves because they can't. Well, they have to. They don't have a language that they've been given, or they're not trusting the language that they've been given naturally. So they set out to discover a language which is theirs, and in doing so, they are somewhat experimental, quite experimental, and it's that sense of experiment and it being at the frontier of a language which excites me, and has given me a lot. I can mention one writer in particular, Nicole Brassard, Quebec writer, who has, I think, made incredible strides in terms of not just the literal language itself, but the kind of attention to the forms that language can take, and this comes through in her in translations of her work, and I find it in her native French as well. So yes, I've been very influenced by a couple of women writers because they're at the frontier of language, and a lot of most men writers aren't at the moment.
Well, I've been more influenced by women's notion of story than language, I think. I think we recognize now that much of our body of story was a male story, beginning the Genesis story on. And what I like is the kind of shift in the very nature of story that takes place, whether it's Daphne Marlott or Audrey Thomas or Margaret Atwood, people like that, who are telling a quite different story and making me aware that I tell a story from a biased point of view, or a point of view that I no longer really subscribe to myself. I've been shaken, rather, in my notion of story itself.
I have to separate how it's influenced me as an individual and how it influenced me as a writer, because most of the writers or books that have influenced me over the last 10 or 15 years have not tended to have been written initially in English. I've been reading an enormous amount of Latin American literature and in translation, and German literature in translation, and so I'm not sure to what extent I've been influenced. And I'm very influenced, as I think all writers are, as much by what they read as what they think or do. That may be contentious, but I'm fairly convinced of that. I think the act of writing is very much related to the act of reading. At any rate, however, in my own life, I'm clearly, influenced particularly in ways that Bob talks about, but also the use of language as one speaks it, quite apart from how one writes it.
Does that answer, or did you want to?
Well, that didn't quite answer that last one. Quite answer. What I'm thinking in terms of speaking then, is there's a fair amount of resistance to changing the language, to recognizing the language as a language through the words and the stories. That has a male bias, that it's recognizing a male bias that shakes up the perception of it, and then what's demanded is like we're going to substitute words here, we're going to substitute, and there's an incredible resistance to doing it. We're actually replacing universal concepts that are supposedly universal, but in fact are not, and have never been universal.
I think the resistance is a healthy one, though. We need resistance. Nothing's going to happen without it. Nothing's going to move without the resistance.
I'd like to pursue something that Bob said about reading women writers has changed your notion of story, and not just, is there something beyond that I was hearing? Not just that it's a female story or it's a different version. Deeply powerful. I'd like your
Well, okay. I read a poem last night called, what is it called? The Criminal Intensities of Love as Paradise. And when I was writing the poem, I used no pronouns. I had lost my faith in pronouns, if you can imagine that kind of loss of faith. But there really is a kind of crisis in the pronoun in our society. He, she, it have got themselves into a lot of trouble. And I simply wrote my way around those pronouns temporarily, and with wonderful consequences. The lovers became the lovers in the poem, and I had to confront a different kind of, a loss of identity into another relationship, which was very exciting. With a bear prowling around, of course, appropriately.
Questions people have?
I'm rather curious as to how each one of you, what made you start writing in the first place. Whether you went to school.
During my teens, I was going to be a professional soldier, and spent a lot of my time in the militia, and was very good at it. And went to military college, and failed out after my first year. Not because it was too military, but they wanted me to learn trigonometry and all kinds of things I didn't think went with being a soldier. And so I went to university instead, because I didn't particularly want to get a job. And it also, there's all those pressures about why one should go to university when one's a confused youth. And I got into university, and I still went to Camp Borden every summer to the Royal Canadian School of Infantry, and I got my commission. But things were changing. I wasn't particularly interested in writing until probably my third year of university, when I went to Edinburgh, and I spent a year there, and it rained a lot. And I didn't have very much money, so I sat around thinking about myself a lot, and I started writing it down. And it was awful. I've never, ever taught in a creative writing class anybody who was worse than I was. For the first 3 or 4 years that I wrote. I really became a writer when I eventually, several years after that, failed my MA at the University of Western Ontario. Under fairly melodramatic circumstances, and fled to England with my soon-to-be wife, and was supply teaching in London, and was so appalled by what had gone on over the couple of years preceding that I decided I would tell my own version And then having written one book, I kind of I had to write the second one because there was stuff left over. And I was subsequently hooked. And I suspect now I couldn't stop even if I wanted to.
That's a hard story to top. But there I was on this mountain, see? No, I suppose I had a father who was renowned as a storyteller, and I spent about the first 15 years of my life totally silent while he told stories. And then I went up to my room after a while and secretly began to tell a story to myself. And I've since read that most Irish writers are the people who couldn't tell stories in pubs, and they went home after the pub closed and wrote the story they wanted to tell, so I'm in sympathy. And then I had a grade 12 teacher who said, "You're always writing, why don't you become a writer?" And I thought everybody was always writing. I hadn't noticed until then that I was the only one. And finally, in grade 4, I won a prize for writing. I won a prize for writing a sonnet or something on health, whatever it was. And years later, I thought I would won it because I was such a fine writer. Years later, a friend of mine told me why I won. I was the only boy in the class who wrote a poem, and all the other boys voted for me, and I won. If I hadn't won that prize, I would have been home free.
Grade 4.
I know. I'm slow.
I guess I wrote a poem in high school, I remember, and got praised for it, and I thought that was pretty good, and then forgot about writing poetry, didn't do anything, and then I guess I started hearing voices.
And what did Pauline say?
Well, I didn't go to school to become a writer, but I guess it was partly because I was at a school that I did become involved in writing, and looking back on it, I think that institutions, schools, have been profound in their contribution to my involvement in writing, because they've always provided a group. It's always been a group of people around, a small group of people who are interested to get together and share their writing. And I think the community, the real community, is very important for a writer. Certainly schools have been that for me.
You know, I'd like to add that I agree there that the sense of that community is incredibly important, and the schools like this and other schools are very central to that sense of community. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? Yeah.
When did you start?
Well, I'm just the moderator. So, other
When did you
questions?
start moderating?
No, Fred has to pick up his car at 4:30. So we're trying to deal with everyone's questions before them. Yeah, Andre.
That the reason for writing are many, but there are two of them which are the main reasons. One reason is to say what you have to say, what you want to say. And you want to put it on the paper, you want to say something. You have something in your mind you want to say. That's one reason. The second reason is to please. Your right to please. And inevitably, one interferes with the other. Maybe in the beginning, you want to write to say. You want to express your idea. You want people to, and then you want people to read it. And when you want people to read it, then you have to please the people. You can't please to everybody. But you start to please to a group of people. And then your writing is already not to wax in secret. Is that so?
I think when you are trying to get the stuff down that you want or need to say, if you are at that point worrying about pleasing anybody, I think that is inescapably true. I think that it's that's a complex one. I think that a culture's literature, and that culture's relationship to its literature, I mean, the responsibility goes both ways, is a really key image of the value of that culture. It therefore behooves us as writers to take enormously seriously whatever it is we're doing, to do the very best that we can, not only for our own egos, but for indeed the craft. I think it probably behooves us on some level, and this is dicey, to know when to stop, if we can. In the actual writing, I'm sufficiently egocentric or romantic or private or personal or whatever. In the actual writing, again, I do not think of the reader or my responsibility to the reader or my responsibility to my society. But I do begin to think of that when I revise. I must make the book as good, but also as available and as clear and as straightforward and as entertaining as I can on its own terms. And it's at that point when I am doing the final revisions that I try very hard to make it as clear and as straight and as entertaining as I can. That's sometimes difficult. But it's real. As an individual, and I don't know exactly why this is. As an individual, I feel a responsibility somehow, both from the community of writers which I'm part of, to the society I live in, and I also look for a comparable return in terms of responsibility.
I suppose for me, the sense of obligation is to write as well as I can write at any given time, and that might be a wrong notion. Perhaps one's obligation should be more directly to readers, but it's almost as if my obligation was to the language itself, to those other books that are there on the shelf, and you are asking for the privilege of putting your book on the shelf, and you have an incredible responsibility in stuffing still another book onto that very crowded shelf.
I feel the same way, that the responsibility I feel is to the work more than to this social thing, or a reader who is the ideal reader, perhaps. But I feel a great responsibility to the work, and as far as readers go, I feel a responsibility to, in a sense, tell the truth, to let the work tell the truth of what's going on. And I think it's part of that truth which I would like to, I guess if there is a reader there, it's there in the truth somehow. I want the reader to pick up on the truth of the act. But I think what you were asking is if I have a social responsibility to the reader. Is that right, Bonnie?
I was just interested in your response.
Oh.
Writing is such a solitary task, and I try to understand how you change and grow in what you do when you don't have a direct relationship with your audience in any way. Is it simply a personal journey? Do you
Certainly not reviewers. Certainly not reviewers. Critics, perhaps, but not reviewers.
I think peer group is very important. It's very important for me, at least, to meet other writers. And I have you have certain writers who become test points almost in your life. I always dread meeting Fred Waugh because he does everything with one word that I do with 10, and so I have this terrible crisis when I meet him. And teaching is very interesting in that sense. It's a very terrible test sometimes, and you have to mouth publicly what you thought privately.
Yeah, I don't think reviews haven't, the few reviews that I've seen of my work haven't meant very much to me. Not that much, but once again, I think the community is important. That is, that I do have a small community of writers who are around, and even if the word is only somehow tacit, even a slight gesture, it's enough. And once again, the community at school, getting immediate feedback to the work I'm doing from students and from other writers who come through, like Bob. I feel I have enough, and I think that's, and reading my contemporaries, finding out what they're doing is with the language, so that I can pick up on, as I was saying earlier, Nicole Brassard has influenced me. She did a lot of work for me. She did a lot of work that I knew I was going to have to do, and she did it, and I don't have to do it now. And it just feels great. It's a real relief.
I'm always interested in what other writers are reading. Like last night, Graeme told me 2 novels I just have to read. See, that kind of thing. And it's almost shorthand for what we're thinking. If he says he likes those 2 books, I know it has something to do with what he's thinking, and then I go read those 2 books when I get home.
I think that all right. I mean, it's obviously one grows as a writer. Or doesn't grow as a writer in some of the same way one grows or doesn't grow as a person, because there is that very sobering boulder in the middle of the road, which is that once one has learned the rudiments of one's craft, one can improve upon that. But finally, as you grow as a writer, you get closer and closer to the point of discovering that your writing is going to be measured by, in some way, the quality of your sensibility, and that it's bloody difficult to know how one can improve upon that. I think there's also no question that one learns a great deal, as both have said already, by reading. And reading, I read very, very selfishly. That I read things which are journeys that I want to partake of. And the reason I want to partake of them is that they are somehow essentially important to me. And if the people whom I'm reading are good, I learn from that. See, when our books are finished, they are in some very real way finished, or for me, or in groups perhaps. That one will write through a certain period, and there's nothing much more for me to be learned out of that. The response that I get or we get from key people, usually other writers, puts all kinds of things in perspective. And the growth then comes from whatever else we're doing and reading. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I would like to add one thing. I think the act of writing itself, when you do it honestly, involves a terrible risk, and you do enter new spaces in your mind and your life, which luckily sometimes enlarge you, make you greater. Sometimes they silence you, of course, make you. But if you really confront them and write them down, you grow in that process of writing.
Yeah, that's very important.
Yeah.
It's a good place to end.
Oh, let's see. Yeah, it's okay. It's fine.
Right into the point of being published, if there is a sense of not only perhaps joy that's going to be published, but a certain sense of reward grows. And I wonder once the book is finished, or the poem is finished, if it is finished, if you put it on a shelf and that's it, or if you continue to try to, are you satisfied? You know, do you get to the point where you're satisfied with the book?
Well, the writers always claim they just abandon a work, they don't finish it, so maybe that's an easy out. Donna, I don't know.
One of the by the time I finished a book, and finishing it really means, in a sense, being finished with it. That involves working with an editor, reading the whole damn thing through once again when it comes back in galleys, waiting for it to hold it in your hand when it is a real book, and then the whole thing of reviews and so forth. Somewhere in that process, I find myself genuinely finished and very urgent almost to get into the next one, and so that they fall away in a central, significant way. Not completely. I mean, one's always very attached to them. At least I am. Slightly embarrassed by some parts to them and so forth. But in the process of having it go through the mill of publishing, there is a real separation for me, and with it, the need to get on with the next one.
It has consequences on my psychological life, but I don't feel ever finished with what I've done. I don't feel that it's ever done with. It's always haunting me.
We have more. Otherwise, we'll stop here. And I want to remind you that at the back table, there's some of the artifacts produced by the writing program at David Thompson here that Noel, the man in the white shirt there, will be pleased to pass on to you. And thank you very much for coming out.
I like the way in China, when you applaud back. Yeah. The Russians do that. Do they? Yeah. The Russians do that. Yeah.